Hey guys, how you going? This is BillyEatWorld again, and it's 2018 now, which means Battlefield 1 is now over a year old. Rumours are already circulating about a new Battlefield game this year, but what's it gonna be? Battlefield 5, Bad Company 3, or even Battlefield 1944? All of this should become pretty clear in the next few months, but what isn't so clear yet is whether DICE is going to continue to evolve Battlefield, or whether it's going to go back to its roots again. So in this series, what we're going to do is take a look at some of my favourite games in the franchise, and some of the things I think make these games so great. Now, I think the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place is because it's hard to believe it's been almost 16 years since the first game in the franchise, BF 1942, came out. And the reason I say this is because, well, when you compare it with modern Battlefield games, sure, things have come a long way, but on the other hand, a lot of things are still the same. So I've been wondering, what was it that made this game so successful? Why is it still so fun to play now? And what hooked us all in? But most importantly, what can DICE do in 2018 to help them recapture some of that magic that BF 1942 had all of those years ago? Well, to kick off, it probably doesn't seem like much now, but back in 2002, one of the first impressions you would have got from 1942 was the scale of the maps. Because back then, pretty much all the most popular shooter games were fairly close quarters, and in all honesty, they still kind of are. I mean, sure, nowadays there's even bigger shooters like Arma 3 and Battlegrounds, but when it comes to size, Battlefield games are still some of the biggest games in the genre. And more than anything, it was pushing the envelope on size that made 1942 stand out back then, which I think newer Battlefield games are going to have to do if they want to stand out again in the future. Also, on that same note, as you can imagine, one of the trade-offs of sandbox games is that they can quickly become walking simulators without some kind of playable vehicles. And once again, BF 1942 was so far ahead of the curve on that one because far more than any other game at the time, it really tried to capture a true combined arms feel. I mean, sure, it wasn't as realistic as dedicated vehicle games, but you could tell, especially from the map design, that vehicles weren't just an afterthought. And I think, as we all know by now, as Battlefield has been becoming more casual and arcadey in the last few years, the vehicles have started to feel maybe a little bit too unrealistic. Now, speaking of realism, well, just like in BF1, Battlefield 1942 certainly isn't 100% true to the historical period it's set in. But with that being said, it is one of the few games in the series to feature historical maps, weapons and skins, even if they weren't completely spot on. And back then, you've got to remember that it was a time when just about every FPS game had you playing as basically some kind of super soldier gunning down enemies left and right. Whereas Battlefield 1942 was probably the first game that I can remember to make you feel like a real soldier in a real battle, and Battlefield games have kind of stayed true to that ever since. One of the things that I think really stands out to me as a way DICE tried to keep 1942 realistic is the fact that, unlike in most Battlefield games, they made the weapons faction locked. And I think what this did was give each faction its own unique identity, which is especially important when you're dealing with real historical battles. If you remember, Visceral briefly tried to return to a softer version of this system in Battlefield Hardline, and plenty of other recent games have done it as well. And so I thought it was kind of surprising that it was gone again in Battlefield 1, which in my opinion is a game that really needed to stay a little bit more true to its setting. But finally, the last point I want to make is actually something I've noticed about 1942 more in the last few days rather than when it first came out. And that's the way it seems like maps are designed to progress in a certain kind of way, kind of like Rush in later games, but without actually being Rush. Basically, the only game mode in 1942 is what we would know today as Conquest, but the thing is, all the maps don't play out the same. Because sometimes, for example, you might start out in a landing craft pushing up a beach, or on the other hand, you might start out in a huge open desert perfect for tank-on-tank battles. It's almost as if DICE created different game modes through clever map design before they were even in the game. Whereas in more recent Battlefield games, it just feels like Conquest has become like a bigger version of Domination, and it's much harder to use tactics than it is in, say, Rush. In 1942, on the other hand, it's a lot easier to predict where the enemy's gonna be, and unlike in modern Battlefield games, each team might need to use a slightly different strategy. And the best thing is, this changes from map to map, which is probably a big part of why I enjoy Conquest in 1942, but not so much in the more recent games. But anyway guys, I think that just about wraps up this video, but before you go, why don't you tell me what you love about BF 1942 and what features it had that you'd like to see come back. Also, let me know what your predictions are for Battlefield this year. Do you think we're finally going to get BF5, or do you think we're going to see yet another spin-off? Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and as always, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and most importantly, keep an eye out for more new Battlefield videos on this channel, and until then, see you later, and have a good one.